Thank you very much, my chairman, my teacher, and my mentor, and Nigeria's father of contemporary international relations, Professor Bolaji Akinyemi. Let me extend my appreciation to the Academy for inviting me to share my thoughts on this very important subject. Now, yes, Professor Akinyemi has said, why talk about Board of Peace? We thought, that was a fleeting moment, the chaotic makeup of the present world order that probably has come to an end. So why resurrect it? It's just as well that we are resurrecting it. As a matter of fact, let me even say that by October 2025, when the idea of a comprehensive program for the Gaza Strip was laid out by the United States and put before the UN Security Council, there appeared to be some kind of important place for a board of peace, the way the articulations came. But by January 2026 in Davos, when the charter was unveiled and the board of peace was finally inaugurated, there were people who were wondering, if this was the same, board of peace that was first offered to the world in October 2026, that the UN Security Council considered and endorsed by Resolution 2803. Now, so that is just as well. It tells us that there is no dull moment these days, in these discussions. Now, I think the larger framework is the evolving new world order. Now, we're not in the habit of, paradigm shifts and the kinds of Kuhnian scientific revolutions that would challenge us to seek new forms of comprehension. But I think that there are concepts that we might begin to rethink, because they have become essentially contested concepts. One of them is world order itself, and the meaning, the significance, the ramifications, that would come with world order. Because order appears to be the antithesis of anarchy. And if one were then to say how appropriate is continued use of the notion of world order, it would only mean that, as analysts, we like to create a framework that allows for some kind of domestication, the kinds of variables that we're going to be considering, and order is essential to that kind of framework. So I would use, world order, I would accept it in that heuristic sense. Otherwise, it is something that I'm sure that increasingly we may begin to question. But when we talk about a new evolving world order, we are already saying that, come to think of it, it's not a given. It's something that has been challenged, is still being challenged, and who knows? Every day is like no other day, and tomorrow may yet bring that world order. So until these things condense and become consolidated, it's a world essentially in transition, and it's perpetual transition, with all the fractures, with all the disjunctures, with all the fragmentations, with all the uncertainties and the turbulence, and so on. So the first challenge for any point at analysis at all is to say, how do we make sense of this order and these changes that are going on? And I think as students and scholars of international relations, if we're looking for the appropriate laboratories to test some of our theories, what we have witnessed in Trump version 2, and no less version 1, is something to say this is the setting for classical realist theory, and new realism. Now, we are reminded that in the classical sense, we have assumptions of a system that is chaotic, and therefore it's an anarchical world where countries are basically unequal, and where it's not just survival of the fittest, but it's also the rule of the mighty and the powerful. So that in a sense, it is a power play, that, always means that, as the Chinese said a long time ago, the small fish eats the smaller fish eats the smallest fish, and so on. So there's a hierarchy, of the fish that eats, all the others. Now, but here we are, there is an assumption of anarchy. There's an assumption of inequality. There's an assumption of, not just a power hierarchy, but, the fact that there are powers that, seek to dominate, all the others. Classical realists would say that that is all down to human nature. The fact that, human beings, are in nature, are selfish, are self-centered, they are only interested in the things that, are of benefit to them, and things that, would take them from where they are to where they want. Neorealism tried to be a little more rational, talking about, the reason of state, and how you could moderate those human instincts and human tendencies with state interests and so on. I say all of this because today there is a personalization of power itself at every level on the international stage. Even the things that we have always known about democratic states that suggest that there are constraints and restraints on the exercise of power within countries, and that those things would affect how power then, is played in the global community, has also diminished. In other words, there's a personalization of power that we have seen, and this is most very robustly represented by what we have witnessed in the United States of America. So let's keep at the back of our minds the fact that we are dealing with a system, the world order that is really in a state of anarchy. It's one where there's intimidation almost as a rule. Now, when Walls and his associates from the neo-realism school thought of the reason of state, they thought of a rules-based system that could constrain, the tendencies assumed in classical realism. But the truth is that even those ones, have fallen apart. Today, we only remember the rules-based international order, more for its violations and infractions than for its use and effectiveness. Now, in all of this, the world has come to accept, within the shortest possible time of Trump's second coming, that we can actually have a world leader who then decides, that you can do anything as it not only pleases you, but that is in the interest of your country. And that therefore you can reinvent the wheel. You can introduce, new foundations and formations and so on. Now, I think that President Trump, has shown very clearly that he is the world order. He is the definer and the interpreter, of the rules, and that he also would determine who can join him, in these determinations. I think that's the context within which we can look at the Board of Peace. Now, like I said at the beginning, in October 2025, when the idea was floated by the United States and presented to the Security Council, this was at the height of the conflict in Gaza, and the whole world welcomed, what would not only be a de-escalation point, a framework for de-escalation, but also for managing the process of transition to a point up until the end of 2027, when you would have an administration that would, be responsible for rehabilitation and regeneration and putting Gaza back on its feet, and not stopping there, also going ahead to lay the foundation for the determination of the future of the state of Palestine. So the 20-point agenda was endorsed by the Security Council and had as one of the instruments a Board of Peace. And thereafter, invitations were sent to countries to come to join the Board of Peace, which was formally inaugurated in Davos in January 2026. From all accounts, over 60 countries were invited. About 25 accepted the invitation to be members of this body, but only about 13 or so have shown any seriousness with wanting to join. Part of the reason is that if you take the graph, if you plot it, you'll find that the Board of Peace, was welcomed and was very strong in October 2025. But by the time January 2026 came, a lot of realizations had then come in that started to change the complexion. First was the drama over the invitation to Canada that was then withdrawn. Canada was told you can't join anymore. So first, it became clear, that you were setting up a Board of Peace that was more or less like a club, a private club, rather than an international organization or even a club of nations. And then, look at the membership, criteria. One is that when you are invited and you accept the invitation, you can join for an initial period of 3 years. But those that would then have sustained membership of what you can regard as permanent post 3-year membership will be required to pay $1 billion US. So some have interpreted this to mean that it was clearly meant to be a club of rich countries, which immediately excluded, certain countries in the world. As I say these things, I want us to go back to the tenets and assumptions of, classical realism, and new realism, and the facts of inequality, the facts of, anarchy and power play, and so on and so on. Now, so that's there. And then comes the preamble that was, veiled at the Davos meeting in January 2026. The entry point for the Board of Peace is to say that, the extant institutions and bodies, that have, taken charge of ensuring world peace have become fragile, in fact, have failed, and that therefore you now needed more effective stronger platforms for dealing with those kinds of issues, including peacekeeping and so on. Now, and then the mandate was to say that you would have interventions in places where there is conflict in the world, and the whole idea would be to have a more pragmatic, a faster response, to points of conflict and so on. Now, the Board of Peace then has an executive body whose chair is President Trump himself. Now, there are no guardrails, on how that kind of body would function, whether it would be by election or not. But people were nominated and appointed by President Trump, to serve on the executive board. All of which seemed to suggest that we're not dealing with an international organization of states. We are dealing with a private, organization whose members would be handpicked, and so on and so on. Now, if you look at the kinds of responses that have come post Davos, people have said quite a number of things. The first is, there's a conspiracy side to it that, has suspected all along, that the whole essence, the objective of the Board of Peace was to have something, an organization, if you like, or a platform that will replace the United Nations. And people say, if you look at the preamble, and the one that says that existing platforms have failed, the reference clearly is to the United Nations. There is another dimension to that. The U.S. is the greatest funder of the United Nations. And when the U.S. has, cut back on its funds, its support for the United Nations and its agencies, the United Nations enters into a crisis. And before you know what is going on, the body becomes less effective. But even more, it's clear, that when we talk about the ineffectiveness of the United Nations, many of us think only in terms of the macro reforms, that have been suggested, how to ensure that the UN is more democratized, more inclusive, and so on and so on, more equitable. And yet, it is clear that if anything has led to the ineffectiveness of the United Nations itself, it is the problem of the Security Council, the permanent members of the Security Council, who have used the veto instrument, to stymie and, create problems for the work of the Security Council. Now, a study shows, for instance, that UNSC, United Nations Security Council, has been rendered ineffective by the abuse of the vetoes that have been used. And it's interesting that the use of these vetoes, just to be comparative, has been more in the post-Cold War era than it was in the Cold War era. Now that between 1945 and 1991, for instance, on the average, you had 2, 3, 4 vetoes, per year. But in 2022, you had 4 vetoes. In 2023, you had 5 vetoes. In 2025, you had 6 vetoes. And, the threat of the use of veto is a big problem for the United Nations. Now, so if you say the Board of Peace is going to replace the United Nations, do you have a veto provision? As far as we can see, there's a sole veto for the Board of Peace, and that's the one by President Donald Trump himself. He has used it, in determining who can be a member or who cannot be. He has used it in the selection and composition of the membership of the executive board. He has used it in setting up the interim administration in Gaza. He has used it even in the composition of the stabilization force and so on. So all of those things would suggest that even if we were going to have a board of peace that would replace, if not the entire United Nations system, but its Security Council, it will just simply be probably a worse form, of the worst parts of the operations of the Security Council. But the Board of Peace is also been criticized for several other reasons. First is it's not inclusive. It doesn't extend its membership to other countries outside of the select few, the ones that may be in the long run able to pay the 1 billion subscription that is required. But the question is, can you have a Board of Peace that does not have in its membership other world powers, China, Russia, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, and so on? I think the answer is up in the air, but it's pretty obvious that these ones are also not sure that they want to be led, by the president, who would get them to do things that they haven't thought about. So, in other words, this is not a Board of Peace that has come about through any treaty. It's not something that has been negotiated. It's not like countries sat together to determine what the form would be post-Gaza. Since now it has, a self-appointed global responsibility that many think would take the place of the UN, but President Trump himself says it complements the work of the UN. Now, if you look at it from the African perspective, I think the only African members that have featured at all are Egypt and Morocco. And then you have, many of the countries in the Middle East, that have come in, and so on. Now, this Board of Peace, after January, went to sleep, more or less. And you would say, where was the Board of Peace, now that we're in Iran? If the Board of Peace cannot be mobilized to be part of the process, of mitigating the war in Iran, then it must have failed its very first test, which is a critical point. But there are those who also say that, one of the ambitions that President Trump himself had, which goes back to the human nature, axis of realist theory, is that he wants to emerge as the world's greatest peacemaker. That in fact, at a point, that would have been his qualification for a Nobel Peace Prize. And it looks like it was a short-run thing to do. And once he didn't get it, the whole idea seems to have died, maybe waiting to be resurrected at another point. But clearly, a Board of Peace, unlike the United Nations, is one that, is not likely to make any headway in any conflict that would involve the United States, especially, or other powers. Now, still taking our bearings from the United Nations, people talk about the Shanghai Cooperation, for instance. People talk about BRICS. And they say these are, platforms that also clearly show the fragmentations that the world order uh, is currently going through. But you will find that the Shanghai Cooperation and BRICS take their bearings from the UN Charter. They actually legitimize themselves as, platforms that, are ancillary to the objectives laid out in the UN Charter. Now, there is no such thing, in the peace, the Board of Peace, and so on. Now, so very clearly, the Board of Peace might actually itself be an instrument of disruption. And that's how it has been interpreted, in many circles. But the tests, have come thick and fast, and Board of Peace has not responded the way it should. I mean, one would have thought, for instance, that once the war in Iran was going, the way it went, there will be reminders that, if the UN is not acting alone, there's also a Board of Peace, but that hasn't happened. Now, there's also been a response to the question of, is it true that the UN has become so ineffective, that we now needed to have, new centers, new platforms that are not multilateral in any definition? Because from what I have said, the Board of Peace is not a multilateral platform. It's not a multilateral organization. Some have said it's just simply a club of people who see themselves as power holders and who are able to do things in a transactional sense with President Trump. Okay, but has the UN really failed? Because I think that's a critical question. People talk about the emerging new world order, and they say that nature abhors a vacuum. If the UN is faltering or, in fact, failing, then it will be inevitable that bodies like the Board of Peace and so on come. Now, in 2024, just to start from the more recent, the President of the General Assembly issued a booklet called Assembly for Peace. And the Assembly for Peace was simply reminding the world, that there are safeguards, there are instruments that make the General Assembly of the UN even more powerful, if you like, than the Security Council. That in 1950, there was a resolution, that allowed the General Assembly to come in, if the Security Council failed to take effective steps, in conflict situations, and so on. And that has been used several times. Incidentally, that resolution itself, came from the United States. It was sponsored by the United States in 1950. And that has been used. It was used in Congo, when the Security Council had a deadlock. It was the General Assembly that came in. The General Assembly doesn't only feature when you have such deadlocks. That instrument has been used over and over again. But the General Assembly has powers. It's authorized to do many things that we think only the Security Council can do. So the General Assembly, for instance, has a disarmament arms reduction committee. It has, specialists, study groups. It has, organizational structures that respond to today AI and, the kinds of new technologies that exist. The General Assembly has passed resolutions, that have been very helpful. So, like I said, if the UN has failed on any ground, it is because the Security Council itself has been problematic. And many of those vetoes, have come from the United States itself. So if the United States has run the United Nations down the way it has, is the Board of Peace the rightful heir? Is it the successor to the United Nations? The United Nations itself, like the League of Nations, came from, extended consultations and involved treaties, involved agreements, consensus, and so on. No such things exist for the Board of Peace. If anything, the legitimacy of the Board of Peace has also been lost. Because, take the European powers, they are very cautious and suspicious of the kinds of objectives that such a board, can achieve. So, in short, if we are going to summarize, we'll say that board of peace, at the time it came, was like a wild wind, that pushed the frontiers of the possibilities beyond imagination. And we probably had the foundations for something that would probably have meant that the UN would now become less relevant in the scheme of things. But I think that the kinds of responses that have greeted the formation of that body suggests that we have not come to the end of a multilateral world, that if anything, agencies like the Board of Peace are actually guilty, of supporting the violation of a rules-based system, to set their own rules in place of international law, to have agencies that don't actually have any basis in international law, but then insist that it is they who would author the laws and implement them the way they understand them. So my final point is, if indeed the Board of Peace turns out to be a private club, it might then be a manifestation of the transactional trajectories of, Trump's own approach to foreign policy making and the exaction of having the superpower. It is unlikely that a board that does not reckon with other world powers, to begin with, China and Russia, that does not reckon with the powers from Europe, but that thoroughly excludes, the global south, in that sense, can be a replacement for the UN. So I'm sure that as things unfold some more, we'll see that the Board of Peace probably emerged at a time to serve very narrowly defined objectives of first becoming a Nobel Peace winner, and secondly, trying to see if you can push for a reduction in the relevance of the UN. It's still pretty much work in progress. The future of the Board of Peace is unclear at this time. But if what we have seen is anything to go by, it is safe to say, that it is not a body that is likely to take the place of the UN. I thank you. I thank you very much for this opportunity to share my ideas with you. Thank you. Well, should I take question by question? Okay, okay, sir. Okay, sir. Now, China rising. There's also Africa rising. I mean, you would hear that, the other day we used the opportunity of the celebration of 50 years of General Murtala Mohammed to return to the question of Africa has come of age, and so on. But in the literature, especially in the early 2000s, there was some celebration of Africa rising because of the high growth rates that African economies, registering, and the more recently we've had, the critical minerals and those voices, and Africa has become the center of a new scramble for resources. So people can talk about there's an African traction that suggests that is going to happen. Now the point is there's been a movement from the possible unipolar world to what today has become multipolar in terms of the layers, multiple layers, of powers, so on. So China, yes, in terms of its economic power, it's probably the point where it has overtaken the United States. China is big, and America is, in fact, one of the things I probably should have said is that it is this stop China, strategy that also went into Trump's calculations in the Board of Peace, because if you look at the countries that it has tried to place on the side, many of them are countries that were pro-China, have been pro-China, and therefore it wants to do that. So American foreign policy, if it had to be summarized today, is to say stop China by all means. So wherever it can be counteracted, you must counteract it. Now, but so is Russia, and so are the other countries that are emerging. They call them emerging powers: India, Turkey, and all of them. Now, would Africa be part of this multipolar world? Would Africa become one of the centers of power? The way Africa has come, the acknowledgement of Africa and African states in, say, BRICS, for instance, which is a pro-Global South movement, even the invitation of Africa to the membership of the G20 as AU, all of those things are acknowledgements of the fact that the time has come when Africa can no longer be consigned to the margins, of world politics. But a lot will depend on what the Africans themselves are able to do. What do you bring to the table yourselves? It's not what they invite you to do. It's not acknowledging that you are important or that you have potential. We've always had potential, but now we are here. How can we, get together to make that African voice count? In saying this, it's important to say that we have the elements that can make Africa rise. So today, you have heard of the things that in Congo, heard of the things in Zambia, cobalt, the lithium, those rare earth minerals, and oil and gas, natural resources. But we've always had these things. What have we done with that? Is there an overarching African framework that can allow us to work? Because one of the lasting lessons that I think Africa has taught, the world in terms of global politics, is that coalition building and alliances, that's the way to go. African countries are too weak and vulnerable, to go alone. Maybe South Africa, maybe Egypt, maybe Morocco, but you will see that these are sponsored, things and so on. We have to sort out the things that we do. So it's been said, for instance, the ASEAN countries have accused those who support the point of peace, of saying this is again another attempt to divide and rule the ASEAN region. When you invite this and not invite this, you see, you are dividing and ruling. Is it possible for Africa to have that kind of coherence and that kind of unity of purpose, that would make divide and rule impossible? So I think a lot more depends on Africa. The world is not going to open up, so you take that place. The realist perspective says it's the survival of the fittest. If you find Africa within it, Africa has to prove its mettle and become more respectable. Moderator, I can go on. Thank you. Now, I think, the first one is for young people. Young people are an integral part of, the agenda setting for a country, whether for domestic policy or for foreign policy. The young people matter. We have always been told, and we say it ourselves, that the future belongs to the young. In fact, one of the things that we cite today is the fact that Nigeria's greatness today and tomorrow is because of his young population. That youth bulge, that's a big thing, and you see that we have made demography one of the 4Ds of our foreign policy. If you unbundle that demography, the youths are there. Now, there's an interesting thing here. I'm sure Professor Bolaji Akinwumi will talk about this. Now, how do you involve young people in all of this? Take our technical aid core scheme, the TAC. Many of the people who go to represent Nigeria in these other countries are young people, almost like an extension of the NYSC. It's like the external arm of the Youth Corps program. And the United States had a Peace Corps program that long ago that brought young people to the rest of the world, including Nigeria. And many people in Nigeria, got JFK scholarships, got those kinds of things. And just before this program started, Professor Akinwumi was reminding me of the strong place of, People's Conference on Foreign Policy. Today, we have a very strong following in all the policy domains, of non-state actors. And they are there. I mean, you just introduced yourself as a budding researcher and so on. I'm sure you're affiliated with one of those bodies and so on. The opportunities exist. Today, you won't believe how much the social media even helps to shape, some of the things that we have to reckon with in the policy domain. And it's mostly young people who talk about those things and so on. So we might not have very clearly defined platforms for youth involvement, but almost all the platforms that we have places for youth. And I think that civil society also offers a window of opportunity. The universities themselves, are part of the resource base that we have for policy making. Your lecturers, yourselves, and so on. When you have your debates and so on, you would think the debates don't go beyond the four walls of your classrooms. We get to see them. And so, but you have a point that maybe we should deploy more pro-youth, opportunities. I think that's well taken. Uh, that should be done. You talked about what's the second question? Oh well, I mean, very clearly, I think that has been partly answered in my response. Foreign policy, but it's about national interests, and national interests are not the monopoly, of only a few elites and so on. National interests, come out of what we all desire, what we want. For instance, today we're challenged, problems of insecurity, problems of, unemployment, those kinds of existential problems mean that in our foreign policy considerations, we must look for ways of addressing these domestic challenges, and therefore it's something that we must all contribute to. These determinations are not from outer space. They come from within us, and we know them. And if for instance you read just the newspapers, or you watch Arise, or you watch channels, or all of those things, and the various platforms that you belong to, on the social media. These are the things you are doing. We may not formally call them agenda setting, interventions, but they are. But like we say, as an institute, thanks to Professor Akinyemi's initiative, we are going to have a People's Conference on Foreign Policy, which used to be the case in Nigeria. Yes, we will do it, sir. That's the job that you have given us. So we'll do it, and you can say that you heard it first here. But now that we have let the cat out of the bag, we are now duty bound to do it. But that's the kind of engagement that has become necessary. Thank you. Well, I'm sure that you have in mind, supra organizations, that are like the United Nations. Otherwise, it is clear that we have several organizations, platforms, alliances, groups, blocks that animate the global order. And all of them have their defined objectives and goals. The point is, it's possible and it's probably better to look at how they complement each other rather than how you have a zero-sum conception that says if it is not this, it has to be this. So those who have criticized the Board of Nations, the Board of Peace, uh, have as one of their strong points the fact that it cannot be as universal as the United Nations has been. It's not a negotiated front. It's not a negotiated platform. There is no treaty that has led to this. It's something that it's a presidential initiative and has been composed along those lines. So, in terms of the objectives of the Board of Peace, I think it started with Gaza, and the Gaza, mandate that it has supposed to end December 2027. There is a stabilization force that should be there, and all of those things. So let's first see what happens with Gaza, and see how much the Board of Peace, can prove to be, what it has set out for itself to be. And then we can take it from there. Otherwise, there are so many organizations, so many of them. And in fact, Akin, one of the things that people also pointed to, we had the Board of Peace. The president of FIFA, the World Football Body, was also there, as an observer. Um, you know, so the whole idea is to say how many women, for instance, are on that board, the Board of Peace. You're talking of inclusivity, talking of those kinds of things. How many women are on the board? How many Democrats, are on the board? You know, those kinds of questions would always arise. But of course, at every level of involvement and engagement, countries will decide for themselves, whether they have problems that can be resolved at the regional level, problems that can be resolved across the regional level, and problems that can be resolved along, say, religious lines, for instance, along other ideological lines, and they can have blocks, that represent these interests. So there can never get to a time when you say there's no more room, for other parties to come in. Well, like I said, I think it was constituted to serve a particular purpose, starting with the intervention in Gaza. And you had a 20-item agenda for bringing hostilities to an end, for interim administration, for rebuilding, and all of those things. And then you had the stabilization force standby. All of those things are expected to make it possible for a proper, a proper response to the Palestinian question after December 2027. So I think that in the immediate short term and short run, let December 2027 come. Let's see how far the board has been able to go with the Gaza question. And then we can take it from there. But as I've said, there are several other conflict zones and conflict centers across the world. We've just, we are still in Iran, and board of peace is not there. We have problems in Sudan. We have problems in Congo. Board of peace is not there. We have problems in Ukraine. Board of peace is not there. So these centers of conflict, these flashpoints, the board of peace would always be challenged, to show its relevance, in these places. So if I may just hazard a guess, I hope that President Trump's interest has not waned in the board of peace. Maybe the fact that the responses have not been as enthusiastic as they were at the beginning might mean that there will be another foundation that is required. So the board of peace might again itself, transform into something else that will make it more appealing and attractive. And so especially now that, as you see, the G20 itself, seems to have fractures. They are thinking of, keeping out some countries and so on. Now, those kinds of fractures would always mean that you need bodies like the Board of Peace that can come in a pragmatic way to fill the gaps, as it were. So going to the future, I see that it may have to be reinvented.